Hello and welcome to AIM North America's Town Hall webinar, DPM for FDA UDI Compliance. I am Mike Ellen and I serve AIM as their Member Engagement Manager. AIM North America is an alliance enabling the cooperation, development, standardization of AIDC technologies. From barcodes to RFID to IoT, AIM North America is your advocate. Any organization with an interest in data collection is a beneficiary of these efforts. Membership provides an opportunity to influence the direction of the industry, develop policies and standards, access market reports, and engage new partners. AIM North America is an investment in your future. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items I would like to go over. First, you will notice that you are muted throughout the presentation. Please do not use the raise hand option during this webinar presentation. If you have any questions during the webinar, please click the chat icon on the top right of your screen. After this, you'll see a chat dialog box at the bottom right of your screen. Make sure in the Send To box you select AIM Inc., and then in the box below type your question. We will try to answer as many questions as we can after the presentation. Our first speaker and moderator for this town hall is Innovative's President and CEO, Artie Batmangelem. Artie has over 30 years of industry experience and most recently has been the chairman of the AIM North America Healthcare Committee. And as one of the authors of the AIM White Paper on UDI, Artie has been immersed in gauging the impact of serialization and UDI and has been assisting the industry toward compliance. Welcome, Artie.
Hi, Mike. First, I wanted to confirm that you can hear me.
Yes.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, which is appropriate given our international audience. Welcome to the presentation on direct part marking under the auspices of AIM North America. As its chairman of the Healthcare Committee, it's my pleasure to welcome three thought leaders in our industry. Jay Crowley is the Vice President of the Unique Device Identification Services and Solutions at USDM Life Sciences. Though obviously there's little need for introductions for Jay, since most of us either thank Jay or blame him for his immense influence as a senior advisor to the FDA on the introduction of UDI domestically and helping guide worldwide UDI implementation through his work at the IMDRF. Creating global implementations and guidelines has helped bring unity among the various countries and regulatory bodies that are going to introduce GoodID, UDAMED, and other versions of it. Since leaving the FDA, Jay serves as the Vice President of USDM, focusing exclusively on providing business process technology and compliance solutions for the regulated life science industry. Our next presenter will be Pat Carnes, who is currently the Vice President and Global Director of Industry Relations at Matrix IT and SteriTrack Limited. Though he hates it when I say this, Pat has been in the trenches for a quarter of a century, working on adoption of cutting-edge implantables to treat chronic conditions. He has many a story of his time in the operating theater, which gives him great insight into the challenges faced by the medical device industry. At Matrix IT, Pat is responsible for providing education on technical advances in UDI solutions. His unique role has been a needed link among all of the shareholders who need solutions for UDI strategies. Last but certainly not least, Pat Schlatter is the application manager for FOBA Laser, a business unit within the Danaher Part Identification group of companies. At FOBA, Pat focuses on the development of laser marking processes for the medical and transportation industries. He has over 30 years of experience in the industrial laser industry, working with a wide variety of laser technologies to direct part products. The agenda for today is actually going to be a little different from what you're seeing here. We're going through the introductions now, and Jay will speak to us for about 15 minutes on the regulation, deadlines, EU versus US, what is and is not technically feasible, etc. Unfortunately, an unexpected obligation has come up for Jay, and he will be leaving us after his presentation. So it just wouldn't be right to let him go without grilling him a little bit. So we will open a Q&A session briefly to address any questions towards Jay, and then we'll start with Pat Carnes' presentation around current, pending DPM standards, application specifications, etc. And then to round it out, Pat Schlatter will talk about DPM applications, best practices, and the nitty-gritty of laser work. And then he'll also talk about his experiences and some of the steps in a project plan toward implementation. And then we'll do additional Q&A at the end. Normally these things run for about an hour. But we are here, and our goal is to continue with the Q&A for a period longer, reasonable period longer. Those of you who have to drop off, please do so. Otherwise, we'll be here answering questions. And now, without using another moment, I'm going to turn it over to Jay for his excellent presentation. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you, Artie, and also pass my good morning, good evening, good afternoon on to everyone as well. Thank you for joining us. I want to spend, as Artie said, 10 or 15 minutes on laying the groundwork so that we understand what actually are the various sort of overlapping and converging regulatory requirements, particularly in the U.S. on direct marking, what that means from a regulatory perspective, direct part marking, where that comes into play and how, and then at the end I'll touch briefly on some of the differences that we're seeing in terms of EU implementation as well. So with that, next slide please, Mike. So let's start off understanding what the regulatory requirements in the U.S. are. And we often use some of these terms somewhat loosely. But for the purposes of this conversation, I want to be very, very specific because they have very specific meanings from a regulatory perspective. So in the UDI rule, there is an additional requirement, what we call the direct mark or direct marking requirement. And that is for those devices that are subject to UDI, but for which there is not a label on the device itself. But for which it's felt that the UDI needs to be available on the device itself, even when it's removed from its packaging or from whatever container had its label. So it's an additional requirement for those devices that are intended to be reused on multiple patients and reprocessed between patient use. And so again, for those devices that are otherwise subject to UDI, that do not have a label on them, the direct mark requirement comes into play and says you have to put a UDI on the device itself. It might be easier to say that the poster child for this as we were developing the regulation was reusable surgical instruments. They obviously come in a package originally that has a label on it. The package is open, the reusable surgical instrument is removed, and there isn't a label on that reusable surgical instrument, but it was felt necessary to provide the foundation for traceability that we put a UDI on that reusable surgical instrument itself. And again, that's a direct mark requirement. Now, there are many ways to fulfill direct marking. Again, I was very purposeful, and I think Artie enjoyed my little slash through the word part, because we often use these two terms interchangeably, direct marking, direct part marking. As speakers later on, particularly Pat will talk about use of laser for direct part marking. That's a specific technology that can be used to meet the UDI requirements. But there are other ways, and I'll touch on in a moment as well, that the direct marking requirement can be met. The UDI rule has some flexibility in terms, and this was very specific and very purposeful, in terms of how the direct mark UDI can be done, should be done. And you'll see in the bullets, the second and third bullets in particular, that the direct mark UDI can be the same or different than the label UDI. So there are reasons that you might want to identify the unpackaged product from the packaged product. And the direct mark UDI can be either, and this is important, can either be an AIDC technology, a data matrix, for example, or the human readable equivalent or interpretation of that, the HRI of the UDI. And there are reasons that one or the other should be used, can be used. It's often the case that there are some substrates for which trying to etch, for example, a data matrix would be very difficult, which is why the allowance for either, you can obviously use both, but that either one will meet the direct mark requirement. And again, I want to reiterate notionally this idea that the direct mark requirement is an additional requirement. You always start with the UDI label requirement. Where is the label of the product? At what level of the device or package contains the label information? It's at that level that a UDI is always required, and that this is an additional requirement. The direct mark requirement is an additional requirement, again, for those devices that are intended to be used on multiple patients and reprocessed between patient uses. And I'll touch more on that in a moment as well. Next slide, please, Mike.
Devices intended to be used on more than one.
Getting some background noise. There are built into the rule as well a number of exceptions, both from a label perspective, but I think most importantly from a direct marking perspective. FDA, we understood that there were obviously situations for which the device could not be marked or where marking the device would interfere with its safety or effectiveness, and therefore there are these 4 self-accepted provisions in the rule. Again, you don't have to submit a request. You do not submit a request to FDA. You note this in the DHF, as it states there, that if marking the product would interfere with its safety or effectiveness, or it is not technologically feasible, then you can, again, utilize this exception and not put the direct mark UDI on the device itself. The last 2 quotes are from the FDA's final direct mark guidance, which came out at the end of last year. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at it, I strongly urge you to. And it speaks to the need to be thoughtful in the use of these exceptions. The first one talks to the technological feasibility. There's constant improvements in this space, so if you have decided that your device cannot be marked because it's not technologically feasible, you need to have a plan in place to revisit that periodically, because obviously technologies improve and change. And then finally, if you're arguing that the direct mark would interfere with the safety or effectiveness of the device, then you really need to have a well-documented rationale. You need to have tried this, right? This isn't intellectual exercise. You really need to go through proper analysis to determine that it really will do that. And this needs, again, to be well-reasoned and well-documented. Next slide, please. So back to the direct mark final guidance. It speaks to a couple of points that are very important when we talk about those devices that are subject to direct mark. And it really carves out a subset of all devices that are reused and reprocessed. Only those devices that are subject to sterilization or high-level disinfection are subject to direct marking. Devices that the IFU states reprocessing is cleaning or cleaning and low-level disinfection are exempt from direct marking, and there are a lot of devices that fit that bill. A lot of things like blood pressure meters or infusion pumps, where they are not high-level disinfected or sterilized between patients, and therefore the direct mark requirement doesn't apply. The guidance also talks to what it means to reuse a device, and it really is this idea of multiple patients, of different patients. So we have this idea in the U.S. It's not well-defined, but you do see it in some documents of single patient use. So a device that a patient will use multiple times themselves, for example at home, and potentially sterilize that product themselves between use. those devices, because again, they're not being used on multiple patients, are not subject to the direct marking requirement. So, again, carving out those devices that are subject to direct marking very directly. Next slide, Mike, please. So that's the direct marking requirement. And again, it applies to those devices that are intended to be used on multiple patients and reprocessed, sterilized, or high-level disinfected between patients. In the proposed rule, proposed UDI rule, we had included in direct marking implants, so that implants would be also subject to the direct mark requirement. It means that those devices would also be able to utilize the exceptions that were built into the direct mark requirement. But between the proposed and final rule, we received a lot of comments from industry that marking implants would be very difficult, very expensive, and that it would be unnecessary because the label of that implant is typically available at the point of implantation. So we removed the requirement for implants to be subject to the direct mark requirement. And in many cases, when we think about cardiovascular devices, for example, most of them are packaged sterile, and so they're in a package with a label, and so it's true that the UDI of that implant is available at the point of implantation. But there are a sizable group of products, particularly non-sterile orthopedic implants, that are not distributed that way. And they are typically distributed in trays or sets or caddies, are sterilized before a surgical procedure, are brought into a surgical procedure, and then those that are not used are removed, and the set or tray or caddy is filled again and re-sterilized for another surgery. And so we don't have typically the UDI of the implant available at the point of implantation. There is no package, there is no label. And so in November of 2014, FDA utilized the exceptional alternative powers in the rule to create, if you will, a higher bar or a different bar for non-sterile orthopedic implants. And FDA said essentially device manufacturers need to find a way, without stating how that needed to be done, and I'll talk about that in a moment, without stating how it needed to be done, but they needed to find a way of making the UDI available at the point of implantation. Again, FDA wasn't stating how this needed to be done, but that manufacturers needed to find a robust and really sustainable way of making that happen. And it's important to note here that the reason that FDA undertook the UDI initiative in the first place, and if you've been watching FDA, particularly in the post-market surveillance activities of the medical device group for the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, you'll see a lot of post-market surveillance activities, a lot of real-world evidence, discussions, NEST, just a whole host of activities, FDA's post-market safety action plan, a whole host of activities intended to improve our visibility into the long-term safety and effectiveness of devices based on documenting UDIs in various information systems, whether that's patients' electronic health records, reimbursement records, what have you, that having this UDI available and being able to document this is central and critical to FDA's really renewed and improved post-market surveillance activities and what they expect manufacturers to be doing as well. So next slide, Mike, please. And so, as I said, FDA didn't state how UDI needed to be made available at the point of implantation. They did not wade into this in the rule in general. We don't say what technologies can or cannot be used. And FDA did the same appropriately here with respect to the non-sterile implant initiative. And so there are a number of ways that this can be done. People have used what we sometimes call inventory control sheets, the documents you see on the left as a bridge, as a way of providing a UDI. It's not particularly robust and not particularly useful, but it is a way of providing the UDI, and so we have seen manufacturers use this as they say, a bridge to other more robust solutions. We have seen some tags used, as you can see in the box in red. where the UDI is on the tag that breaks away before the implant is used. We have seen a number of manufacturers move where they can to sterile packaging, as you can see on the right. And then finally, we have seen a number of manufacturers move to direct part marking, the topic of this webinar, for these orthopedic implants. And you can see two views of the same implant there where we have put on the manufacturers put on a data matrix as well as a human readable, so both pieces of information on this particular implant. Next slide, please. So briefly, just talking about EU, so for those of you who've been following the activities with the new medical device regulation, there are very, very similar requirements both for direct marking, as I described it, though the European Commission has not limited the subset of devices or the set of devices subject to it. So again, it's devices that are subject to any reprocessing that would be subject to direct marking, though they do talk about between patient uses. So I think we can also carve out single patient uses devices, but again, it's all devices that are reprocessed and used on multiple patients. And the way the rule is constructed, unfortunately, I don't think it was intentional, but it states that the UDI needs to be both AIDC and HRI to meet the direct mark requirement. And just as I discussed the non-sterile implant initiative, we have a similar set of requirements for implantable devices, essentially creating the same mandate, which is that the device's UDI needs to be available prior to, or I would argue at the point of implantation. So very similar requirements in Europe as well. So if you're thinking about your strategy for both direct marking and non-sterile orthopedic implants, if you're in that space, the requirements are fundamentally the same. Next slide, please. And that's it. I thought that might be the end. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them now, Artie, if that works.
Absolutely, Jay. The first one that we have, and folks, Mike is taking questions through the chat. So if you have questions for Jay or in the future for our other speakers, please put them in now so that we can, strategize and pass them on to the speakers. The first one I have for you, Jay, is it's a comment for your feedback, and it says, the DM is required whether or not the device had a label. DM requirements are for reusable devices which are expected to be separated from its label over time.
Yes. So if the device, and we see this sometimes, for example, with endoscopes, the endoscope itself has a label on it. And so it's on that level on the endoscope, if you will, on the endoscope's label or on a similar location, that the label requirement would come into play. It would be required. And so you would have a UDI on the label, and I'm doing little air quotes. And the direct mark requirement would be unnecessary, if you will, because there's already a UDI on the device itself. So there isn't, I would argue, I mean, you could state it either way. It's irrelevant because there's already a UDI on the device itself, or you could argue or state that the labeled UDI meets the direct mark requirement. The net is the same.
Great, thank you. Next question. May a label, or I'm assuming a labeler, voluntarily comply with UDI direct marking requirements?
Of course, yes. And we certainly encourage those to do it. Great.
Next, is the full UDI required to be directly marked on the device?
Well, as I mentioned, the UDI can be different than the label UDI. And so I'm going to make kind of a leap here, Artie, but what we typically see, for example, is that if a device is initially packaged sterile, and so say it has a lot number and expiration date because it's sterile in its package, it's then removed from that package and can be reprocessed. The expiration date, for example, doesn't have any meaning at that point once the device is removed from its package. So you could have a UDI, that's the direct mark UDI, that would just be, say, the DI and the lot number. So it doesn't have to be the same, but it has to represent that unpackaged, unlabeled product.
And just to add to that, I think if the question was, can they get away with just the DI without the PI, I would imagine that the answer is no, that this is about production identifying.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
What is the timeline for acceptability of the inventory control sheet or web available GTIN cross-reference sheets?
Oh, I think maybe I'll let Pat, or the next speaker, speak to that. I would say that we're in a sunset phase as hospitals begin to leverage UDI in operating rooms and other requirements come into play. I think you're going to find, manufacturers are going to find they need solutions that are robust, that hospitals can implement quickly and easily. And with some level of confidence and precision in the information that they're getting. So I'll let Pat Carnes talk to that.
Great, and I will ask that question again during the next phase of the Q&A. Here's a good one for you, Jay. For a device manufactured prior to the compliance date, are we expected to take devices off the shelf and etch them with a UDI?
You have to look, and actually the direct mark final guidance speaks to this, so I would encourage you to take a look at this. The existing inventory exception doesn't include the direct mark requirements, if you will. I mean, it was more of a label requirement. So there's, if you're in the existing inventory exception, there is some overlap, but at some point the direct mark requirement isn't included in that, and so yes, if you've reached the deadline, you don't add the existing inventory exception to the direct mark compliance date. It doesn't work like that. But again, I would encourage you to take a look at the final guidance because it speaks to this very directly.
Thank you. Next. What are the record-keeping requirements for devices that must be directly UDI marked?
They're the same as the other UDI record-keeping requirements in terms of information that needs to be captured and length of time, but you need to have, as you would with the label UDI, you need to capture that information associated with that particular product and maintain that over the life cycle of the device.
Great. Here's a question, and I'm going to expand it a little bit. So the original question is, when making a data matrix, they are only required to have an additional HRI for devices in the EU, but the expansion of that, from my perspective, is if I'm a global manufacturer that wants to have a single process, and I know the product can go to Europe and be sold domestically, am I forced, or should I be considering both AIDC and human readable on my direct part marking starting as soon as possible?
I think it's a great question, Artie. I think it depends on whether you believe both are practical and necessary, or whether the wording in the European regulation was an oversight. And again, it wasn't direct, if you will. The way the rule is constructed and the use of the term UDI carrier being defined and then used throughout. But I think it's an interesting question and the discussion is still going on in Europe. I mean, we'll have to see what happens with other countries as well, since many of them leverage many of the European constructs in other places, in other countries. So I think where feasible, practical. I think it's certainly a reasonable idea for a host of reasons to consider both. Now, there are situations where both are not practical. You don't have the space. The material doesn't lend itself to it. And so, I think there's a reasonableness to that, reasonableness test to that we need to consider. Where you do have the room and the space and the substrate lends itself to it, I think it's certainly worth considering.
Great. And I'm combining a couple of questions, and these are the last questions for you, Jay. So,
Okay.
So the combination of the question and what you've already answered is, if I have limited space and I have to have the PI, which is most important, lot number or expiration date? And I think you already answered that.
Right.
Likely drop the expiration date. But
Correct.
Also, if you only have space for either AIDC or human readable, in the US we know what to do. What are the choices for Europe?
So Europe has this whole conversation in the rule that states essentially that if you were going to go into a professional setting, you probably want AIDC. Notionally, people are going to be scanning, say, in a hospital. And that notionally, in say, a home environment, they're probably not scanning, and the HRI is preferred. So that's kind of the model that we're dealing with today, and I think it's a fairly reasonable approach.
Terrific. Thank you, Jay, for your insights and for your presentation. Sorry that you had to leave. At this point, do you have any closing remarks before we move on to Pat Carnes?
Only, Artie, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And if anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to follow up with me.
We're going to move to Pat Carnes' presentation around current and pending direct part mark standards and emerging technologies. All yours, Pat.
Thanks, Artie. I appreciate the handout. Once again, my name is Pat Cairns, Vice President of Matrix IT, and my topic today is current and pending DPM standards and emerging technologies. My topic today is going to be talking about the regulatory environment, going to emerging technology, as well as what the end user is looking to do with the information. So, this as well as a couple of the conversation or questions that came through with Jay, I'm going to address in this slide. And there was a real good guidance that was given to the market through the FDA in the Q&A section of their final guidance. And the question that came was, may labelers voluntarily comply with UDI and direct marketing requirements? And that is a yes from the FDA. The FDA definitely encourages fixing the UDI on the devices not when required. What is the format that they would like to see? The UDI direct mark must include the DI plus the PI portion of the UDI. And then also, if there's limited size, what would they like to see you use in terms of how are you conveying the UDI? And essentially, the FDA would like to see the AIDC technology, the data matrix code. And that's a couple of reasons I would surmise. One, because the data matrix code has error correction built into it, and you can pack a lot more information into a code which can be accurately read via machine versus relying on potential human error. Next slide, please. Okay. All right. This is one of the final questions on the guidance in the Q&A. In terms of your exceptions in self-reporting, is that you periodically reassess your use of your exceptions. And what I wanted to illustrate to everybody today, the manufacturers especially, is that there are manufacturers out there that have chosen to go with a direct part mark and using direct marking as a strategy for UDI compliance. what you see in the lower left-hand corner. Can you go back one slide, please? Okay, thank you, Mike. What you see in the lower left-hand corner here is a pedicle screw from a current manufacturer used in spine surgery. You can see there's a direct part mark there. It's a data matrix code that represents the full UDI for that product, the DI and the PI, and the equivalent size of that code is 2 millimeters squared. The item in the right is a spinal rod, which is part of the set with pedicle screws commonly used in fusions to create stability in the spinal segment. That rod itself was marked at the end of the rod on a flat portion of that rod. That's a 1 millimeter data matrix code. As you can see, the green square accurately read that product, as well as the data string that's encoded in that. That represents a full UDI. And two things to consider here as a manufacturer. Number one is how small can you mark would be one, and then if you have limited size, where would you place that mark? As you would realize, this is a cylindrical device with flat ends, and what this manufacturer chose to do was place the mark at an end that allowed use of their instrumentation for implant by the end user, as well as place the mark on a flat surface so that it can be easily scanned in the operating room and then subsequently handed over to the surgeon for implantation. Next slide, please. Okay, so where are we at with emerging technologies? Lasers have always been able to mark very small codes. The problem is rested in what can be read. And on the upper left hand of the image there, I placed a Eurocent next to a couple of products from a manufacturer that is direct part marking. You see the set screw there on the far left. That is a 0.7 millimeter squared data matrix code. That code itself does have 57 characters embedded within that data matrix code, which would more than represent the full UDI for that product. The item in the middle is an aneurysm clip. That is a 0.3 millimeter squared data matrix with 30 micron X dimension. That also has 23 characters, which would represent a proper UDI for that product itself. And in the lower right-hand corner, the X dimension or the module size on that is 30 microns. You can see that that was successfully scanned and that the data matrix code itself was placed in an area where the instrumentation that is used in surgery to apply that clip does not interfere with the data matrix code itself. So once again, as manufacturers, it's good to pay attention to how the end user is going to be using this and how it might be scanned in a clinical environment. Next question, or slide, please. Okay. Standards that we talk to manufacturers about are ISO IEC 1415 or 15415. And the ISO TR 29158, which is the engineering document for verifier manufacturers and application specification developers. In order for standards to remain relevant to the industry, every 5 years they undergo a review process to make sure that they are looking at current technologies that are evolving in the marketplace, as well as the manufacturers need to comply, so they look to this for guidance. So currently, next slide please, the ISO has developed a work group for IEC 15415 and TR 29158. And as you can see from previous slides that micronized data matrix codes are evolving and the reading technology is coming right along with that. So this work group is working on updating this and reviewing the standards as they exist today to recognize microdata matrix codes and solutions for non-paper-based applications to allow for more comprehensive verification standards for direct part mark. This update is currently underway, and this particular work group expects to finish this in 2019. Next slide, please. So in the left-hand side of the slide, what you see here is a process control metrics report for the design history file on this actual product here. The application specification was developed here so that this manufacturer could scan this product as well as present the grade for this. And on the right-hand side, what you see there is the actual products that would be scanned in surgery. For those of you that are wondering where is UDI going and direct part mark of medical implants going, the development is underway of scanners to sit in the sterile field of the operating room. The marks that you are applying to your products will be scanned, and that information will then be conveyed via Bluetooth into the nurse's circulating room, nurse's laptop, to be included into the EHR and into the server so that all of that information can be shared among stakeholders. One of the questions at OMTech that we got recently is where is all this information going and why is it important? Nobody tracks it now, so what difference does it make? The next slide and final slide here is a slide that was presented at OMTech by Mike Schiller, who is the Senior Director of the Materials Management side of the American Hospital Association. Mike has been instrumental in putting together probably, I think, 9 or 10 learning UDI community groups, which is free for everybody to join and help out. But the hopes of this is, or the product of all these groups is that manufacturers, end users, hospitals, and get together and start to look at UDI a lot more closely and the benefits that it brings. This is one of the slides that he brought up that I got approval to use today, is that hospitals and as Jay mentioned earlier, programs like the FDA's NEST program are all about getting data. And the data that they're getting is what they want to do is get as complete as possible, which is the full UDI. And in many instances, it's as important as the product. It helps with the supply chain. It helps understand clinical use and future use of that product. It's important for electronic health record and that record being accessible, regardless of potentially what hospital system you might be in, as well as the post-market surveillance and the development of further medical devices. So anyway, that's a summary a real quick summary of what's going on out in industry right now and to give you a heads up in terms of what's going on with the standards. At this point in time, I'd like to turn it over to my friend Pat Schlatter to talk about DPM applications and best practices.
Thank you, Pat. Next slide, please. I have listed here some questions that have been asked in the past concerning direct laser marking of UDI codes. What makes stainless steel so desirable? Do finishes of the stainless really matter? What type of laser mark is really the ideal mark? What do they have to survive? What parameters can be adjusted to achieve that desired mark? Also some examples of UDI marks on both flat and cylindrical parts. Think of direct laser marking as a controlled heating of the metal, and that controlled heating of the metal results in a mark that is visible. Next slide. Stainless steel's chromium oxide barrier offers a natural passivation layer that can self-restore from damage in normal handling. And in the case of corrosion that would occur, it would not self-restore. And so passivation using acid could be used to restore this chromium oxide barrier layer. So it is often that after machining and processing that the stainless steel instrument would be cleaned and then a passivation process to restore its corrosion resistance would occur. Next slide. The laser marking of metals can be categorized into two categories, ablative or oxidative style marks. The advantage of ablative is that it is a fast process and it's very easy to identify laser settings to etch a material. However, it is often resulting in mechanical microcracking. Since you are etching into the material, it's a bacteria shelter. As a countermeasure to this, some will electropolish after processing a part in this way. However, the end result would be a mark that is an engraved style mark without much color change, which is not as interesting as an oxidative process where you can achieve a very high contrast mark with good definition. And the only drawback to it is it's a little more sensitive process-wise to achieve a proper black tempering style mark. And also, it tends to be a unique process for each and every manufacturer, primarily because they each have their own passivation process and other subsequent processes within the manufacturing that are slightly unique to their peers. In this slide, you will notice an array of laser marks, and you see a rainbow of color, and that is showing the color tempering. And you see also in the upper left some black tempering, and I'm not sure that any annealing is shown in these pictures. But annealing would be a far extreme in terms of the mark. Next slide, please. So tempering or annealing, I often hear one state that they want an annealed style mark for a UDI code in stainless. However, it's not quite correct. You would like a black tempering mark, which does not affect the surface topography of the material. So you're keeping the temperature between 370 and 650 C, and in doing so, you will achieve a thick black oxide layer that is smooth and leaves no surface damage to the material. Next slide. So how do we achieve this? Is accomplished by controlling the energy density of the laser beam at the surface of the metal. And in doing so, there are a number of laser parameters that allow for this to happen. The choice of laser and lens focus combination have an impact, but from a program standpoint, there are a number of additional settings. The pulse frequency of the laser and the speed at which you write the image, which results in the pulse spacing, is critical, along with the intensity of the laser beam and the fill density, which is sometimes overlooked, but is very critical. And in this case, if you look on the inset, you will see each one of the cells of the data matrix code consists of a series of horizontal line segments. And the spacing between each of those lines, which is a laser track, is critical to the amount of heat that is imparted into the material. So the combination of these parameters, which can be stored and operated through a mark program, are all important for the proper execution of a good laser mark. Next slide. Here you see oxidative black tempering style marks in both bright and matte finishes of various types of stainless steel. Note each square denotes a mark achieved with a different combination of laser settings. Next slide. The cleaning process is the first process the laser marks have to withstand after marking. Fortunately, black tempering style marks see little to no impact from cleaning. Next slide. Passivation, on the other hand, is more aggressive as it dissolves ferrous oxide compounds on the surface, and in this case, citric or nitric acid in a ultrasonic bath would be used to dissolve these compounds and to restore the corrosive protection that one wants with stainless steel. Next slide. In this picture, you see, again, several stainless steel materials that have been subjected to both to cleaning, to passivation, and additionally to some corrosion testing. The marks that are within the green boxes are identified as marks that have survived all of these processes and would be useful for marking good UDI codes on stainless steel instruments. Next slide. So we've talked about achieving a good laser mark in stainless. Here are some examples of laser marks that have been achieved in a matte stainless steel. You see from 1.5 mils, which is essentially a 1.5 thousandths of an inch single cell size, or X dimension, up to a 5/1000th of an inch single cell size for a full UDI. And in this case, these codes can be read with commercially available scanners and verification equipment today. The code that you see on the right has a 2/2000th of an inch X dimension, and this particular code is shown above and blown up so you can see it better. There is a background, and this background is also a laser processed, and the reason for it is that on bright finishes, you enhance the readability of the code by providing a matte background and overlaying the code over top. And all of these codes have survived cleaning, passivation, and many sterilization cycles. Next slide, please. Cylindrical surfaces present other challenges for a data matrix code or any sort of machine readable code. In particular, if the material has a bright finish. On the upper right, you see a picture of a rod that has a matte background that was laser marked with the rectangular data matrix code overlaid on top. This code is shown to the left, in the lower left, and that is an image of what the verifier sees of that code. You note that the lettering and the code is very clear and without reflection. And this is the advantage of a dome light that produces a much higher contrast, lower reflection image. The top code on the left is 4 thou, so basically 100 micron X dimension, and the one on the bottom is 152 thou, X dimension. And both of these codes, of course, easily read. With the advantage of dome lighting, one can recognize a much greater a code size, and so you can mark much further around the diameter of the part and still have a good readable code in one that's also completely verifiable. The lower right, you see a titanium rod, in this case, that's a matte finish, and where both the rectangular code and the human readable have been marked. And that particular part can be easily read without having the background, primarily because it was a matte finish. Next slide. So in summary, I think we've hit on a number of these points, that the reason for stainless steel choice a lot is because of its natural corrosion resistance. Matte and satin finish materials typically can use similar laser settings. A bright finish typically requires a different set of parameters to achieve the best result, and usually a background as well. The black tempering style mark that doesn't disrupt the topography of the surface of the material is most desirable. And as far as UDIs in cylindrical rods, if you have a matte surface and you are not using any sort of background, recommend a 16% of the diameter rule as far as the height of the code. And if you do have a background and also dome lighting, you could increase that to about 50% of the diameter. Again, what you need to think about is that the laser process is really a controlled heat source, and we're adjusting laser settings to achieve a proper energy density at the surface to produce this this style mark. Next slide. So this next part of my talk is about the project plan development and implementation. So just a few slides on this. So the way to begin would be to define the product and the process flow and identify what needs to be validated, making sure to consider all protocols and specifications that are germane, and of course document, and then go for approval. It's important to note that the process validation does need to be done prior to device release. Next slide. So stepping to the side for a second about what is process validation. And under FDA, it is a legal requirement of the manufacturer to go through the process validation. It's essentially the collection and evaluation of data from the beginning design until the commercial production, which establishes scientific evidence that the process is capable of consistently delivering quality product. And typically there are 3 stages. There's the process design stage, the process qualification, and the continued process verification. Next slide. In large part, this is what manufacturers would typically follow. The IQ, OQ, PQ, MQ steps to achieving a stable and capable process. The initial qualification is really the documented evidence that the laser marking equipment that is used meets the specifications and is installed in accordance with the requirements as spelled out by the manufacturer of the laser equipment. The operational qualification, again, is a documented evidence protocol that the laser and all of its options are functioning as intended, and also any errors that might occur have a recovery and a documented recovery and how they can be handled. The process qualification is related to the documented evidence that the laser marking process itself is in control and can be sustained in a commercial manufacturing environment. This is an area that requires scientific process to identify through statistical control that you have indeed a stable process. And typically, manufacturer will bracket parameters such as slight variation in laser power, a range in pulse frequency for the laser, and potentially slight variation in the writing speed to define the process that's in control. And if the IQ, OQ, and PQ are accomplished, then you would have a stable and capable process. The MQ, which is the maintenance qualification, relates more so to the ongoing maintain of the machine, making sure that it is calibrated and within specification through its operational life. Next slide. So the third stage in process validation relates a lot to the monitoring of the process and the ongoing manufacturing of the product. And in part, this is proper documentation and in control of these process parameters. It's facilitated with these computerized laser marking machines, whereby they automatically generate log files that keep records of many aspects of the laser marking process and the parts that were being marked. In many cases, manufacturers offer pre and post mark inspection, mark alignment, so that the mark is placed in a particular spot to a higher accuracy, and of course the code verification, and this gets fully documented in an automated way. And the end result is a short and positive FDA compliance audit, which is the goal for many of the manufacturers of this equipment. I think with that, that's my talk for today. I think hand it back to you, Artie, for
Thank you, Pat.
questions and answers.
Gentlemen, great job, and even with the slight change in format, we're about 6 minutes over our allotted hour. However, as threatened earlier, we are going to continue taking questions, and there are a significant number of them. Those of you who have to leave us, thank you for joining. We appreciate it. And we will now go to the questions that have been submitted, and I have a list here. So here's an interesting one, Pat Schlatter. What is the level of technology for microdata matrix for non-metal reusable devices? Can it be done? Do lasers do it? How do you mark them?
It can be done. There are shorter wavelength lasers for non-metallic marking, such as UV, that would offer much smaller spot sizes. So it really depends on the surface finish of the if it's a thermoplastic. But it's possible to achieve. I know I have in the past achieved better than around 40 micron X dimension without much difficulty. And I think that number can go much smaller. It really does depend on the thermoplastic.
Great, thank you. Next question, how is the matte finish created on the devices that were being direct marked?
On a bright finish material, the laser is scanning across the surface of the part at very high speed at a lower power to achieve this matte background, and then the laser mark, the UDI code, is then applied over top. There are also techniques where only the light cells, if you would have this effect, and then the dark cells are marked in the area that has not been marked. So both techniques have been used.
Great, thank you. How is the corrosion testing performed to simulate time and usage on marks that are created on metal?
I think I would have to defer. I don't have a lot of data on the accelerated corrosion testing. Most of the work that I have been involved in, the end user has actually cycled the specimens through sterilization cycles, and I'm not really sure that they have accelerated them too much. I've been involved in studies that have produced over 500 cycles to confirm the durability of the mark. Each manufacturer has come up with their own protocol in this way. Some have limited it to, say, 25, and others to, say, 50 cycles. And they've said that if it hasn't achieved any difference between the 25 and 50, then they've stated that that's sufficient. So that's somewhat open.
Understood. And if there are any manufacturers that have direct experience in this and want to share it, send some text to Mike, and I can read it out without identifying anybody. In the meantime, as expected, there's excitement around size of the mark and the readability of the mark. And I have several of them, so I'll read them out, and then if you guys want to address them. One is it permissible to mark the data matrix below 100 micron cell size recommended limit, which is the recommended limit? And then another question similar, is there a minimum size for AIDC on a 2D matrix? Another is, I thought I read the minimum module was 0.01 millimeters. Has this requirement changed? So I think those are very similar. And Pat Cairns, do you want to take a shot at responding to that?
Sure, Artie. Before I do that, I know that there was a white paper that was presented on the 500 samples. Perhaps we could get that and circulate that if people were interested in that in terms of the durability of the mark. But going back to your question, the 100 micron X dimension comes up a lot. When it comes to issuing agencies, you absolutely must adhere to the data structure and that they recommend. That's an absolute. Without that, there is no standard, obviously, right? But when it comes to the size and the data matrix symbol and the X dimensions, there is no size constraint imposed by the symbology standards itself through ISO. So that's, in term, and that's a confusing point to a lot of people out there, is that, absolutely adhere to the data structure format, but when it comes to the data matrix, ISO does not put any kind of size constraint on the X dimension.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a question, and you know, as is always the case, I wish Jay was around still, but if a labeler makes a change to a device that requires assigning a new UDI, must the existing mark be replaced? Do you guys want to address it? I think, hi, Cairns, do you want to address this, or shall I take a shot at it?
Well, I'll give you my opinion on that. I think it becomes a new device at that point.
Yeah, well, I would imagine if there are reasons why the UDI of the device has to be changed, there cannot be two UDIs on that same device. So that has to be replaced with a new device. However, I think it is important to note that the label and the unique identifier on the label and the unique identifier on the device can be different. So that's part of the consideration. And this may not be a complete answer, but those are the ones that we can think of at this point. Next question. In terms of clinical scanning, what would you say is the average minimum UDI dimension that most hospitals are capable of scanning?
Good question. I would say that, for sterile product that comes from manufacturers, that's anywhere from, 3 millimeter data matrix codes to your normal, linear barcodes. That's not an issue. In terms of the direct mark, this is a question I think that we're still looking at. In one of the areas that is still being researched, obviously you can see through the aneurysm clip at 0.3 millimeters squared. Where we really need to start to focus and think about this is that the device itself, that you have to be able to identify where the mark is, correct? And a 1 millimeter data matrix code is pretty easy to identify with the human eye. And but in terms of a scanner, that's incredibly easy for the scanner to see a 1 millimeter code. And these are areas where we're actually in testing right now. We're running testing on what is clinically acceptable out there, because one of the things that we don't want to do is slow up the surgical pace, right? So I think, and when I give advice to manufacturers, it's make a mark that's actually as small as practical, but not as small as possible, and put it in an area where it's easily identifiable. Does that answer the question? And you can be honest.
Well, I believe it does, and it came very close. I think there's, in my mind, there's a difference between normal handheld devices that are routinely used for scanning data matrix barcodes. And then there are more specific, more high-powered ones that can go even lower for surgical suite and that kind of activity. So I think that's some of the differentiation that must be taken into account.
Correct.
Depends where the audience is.
Right, and correct. And the main reason for this, or my whole segment, or the segment that we're working on in Pat Schlotter's, is that, the standards that are out there today are being outpaced by technology. And that's why they need to be updated and revised periodically to remain relevant. Otherwise, you would have an environment out there where standards wouldn't necessarily apply because people would be doing their own thing, and we don't want that.
Understood.
And so what you're coming up with is you're coming out with, and there will be the development of a whole new series of scanners based on recommendations that'll be done through the ISO updates using the current technology of today and how this emerging technology is pacing.
Great. Here's a good one. What is the most commonly used code for direct part marking?
By far, data matrix code.
I would agree. Absolutely.
Well, and let's you know, if you want to go back to the slide that Jay used and one that Pat had shown, it had both HRI and data matrix code, and he showed a blown up image of that actual both of those codes. And if you can imagine holding, you know, say a spine rod, and that was the example that was portrayed there, is that HRI was almost impossible to read, and I think the only way that you could properly convey that information if you're trying to do HRI is adding a magnifying glass in the sterile field versus having a scanner read that mark. I think there's a big difference in terms of the accuracy of the data as it's transmitted and the ease of transferring that information as well.
Right, and certainly if the choice is between human readable and AIDC is preferred. And if the choice is between what kind of AIDC, assuming that we're not going into RFID of any kind, then the data matrix is by far the best solution because of size, because of error correction, and all of the other aspects that encourage us to use the data matrix.
Right.
Great. Next question is, what level of investment and when will healthcare providers be able to read a micro data matrix?
Level of investment. Obviously, like any other scanner, there's going to be a cost to that. There'll be drape cost to that. But you know, in terms of level of investment, I think it would be a modest level investment, and I think there's studies that are being done today to show that the transference of that information will actually speed up surgical time. That the information is more accurate. So I think there's going to be a cost-benefit analysis on that. That'll be offered as well. But just like any new technology, like robotics and things like that for surgery, the studies will probably provide, you know, valuable information and cost-benefit analysis on that.
But the technology is available today.
Yes, it is
to
available.
Make it and read it.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
And that, along the line of the producing the mark, within reason, so 40, 50 micron X dimension codes can be produced with the same laser equipment today that's produced in the 100 micron X dimension codes.
Great. Thank you. Here's a question that's good to ask. I don't know that we can answer it with a definity that it desires, but if for supply chain reasons we direct part mark GTIN on a device that does not need a UDI, e.g. a non-sterile kit case or tray, are GTIN allocation rules suggestion, or are we required to follow them? If we add change kit content, are we breaking regulation by keeping the same GTIN?
I think that sounds like a great question for Jay.
I'm going to take one stab at it. GTINs can be used for non-regulatory functions. And if you are using GTINs, it means that you need to follow the recommendations and requirements of GS1 for that purpose. But I don't think you're breaking any regulations by keeping the same GTIN. But certainly that's an opinion, as we stated earlier. How long does it take to implement a direct part mark project?
Well, the impression that I have from speaking to, I think we got an echo going on here.
Yeah, that's Patrick. Leather.
Pat, I think we hear you okay if you want to finish your thought.
Okay, so typically I've seen the 6 months to a year. 6 months is a really tight time frame, and only possible with those that have all their ducks in a row. But I would say that the more realistic time is typically in the 9 months to a year for the full implementation.
Great. Thank you, Pat. And I think we'll close it on that. We're almost an hour and a half into it. Everybody, thank you very much for joining us. We hope this was helpful in your decision-making and planning. And we look forward to feedback and any additional assistance we can provide. Thank you and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And just so everyone knows, we will be we did record this. It will be on the AIM North America website, and everyone that has registered for the webinar will receive a notification of when that's up and available to download. So thanks again, and everyone have a great day.
Bye-bye.